All right, guys. Here I want to talk a little bit about some important studies that describe the social experience and specifically how they describe how people change their behavior in order to fit into a group. Now, one of the most recent studies is Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. In the Stanford Prison Experiment, college age young people, men specifically, were split randomly to be into one of two groups. They could either be guards or they could be prisoners. And if they were prisoners, a real police car went to their homes and arrested them and brought them to Stanford, the college. And in one of the buildings, there was a basement where the prison was situated. It wasn't a real prison. And they had to stay there the entire 2 weeks. Whereas if they were the guards, well, the guards came and left in shifts. Now, the study was originally mostly about the prisoners and how the prisoners behaved as they sort of conformed to their prison identity or their prisoner identity. But very quickly, the study became a little bit more about the guards because it was the guards who began to take their role very seriously. And more specifically, they started to abuse the prisoners. At first, it was very simply by making them do push ups or having them call out their number instead of their name. And they did roll calls and things like that. And it wasn't very long before the prisoners sort of staged a riot. And later on, when the prisoners met with their parents, they had like a visiting hour, the prisoners would say things like, "You have to get me out of here." Of course, you have to remember that anybody, they could just walk out. This wasn't a real prison. But they took their role so seriously that they kind of felt trapped. And the parents, who again could have just said, "Well, let's go," didn't. They would say, "Well, let me see what I can do about that." Because it's very easy to fall into these social roles and just start taking them way too seriously. This study had to be stopped after one or two of the prisoners essentially had just breakdowns, just panic attacks. And before the 2 weeks were over, they had to stop the study. Today, we think about the Stanford Prison Experiment as being one of the most unethical studies, at least in modern times, because sort of the damage that was done to these students. There are sort of movies about it, and in some of the documentaries, the boys who were prisoners said that it sort of changed their lives. Some of them changed their career choices and went into law to sort of protect the rights of prisoners and things like that because of the events that occurred here. Mind you, again, it was about a week long before it was stopped. Okay, let me talk quickly about the Milgram experiment. The Milgram experiment is a little bit older. It happens after World War II. There was a belief in the scientific literature and just sort of society in general that the reason the Germans were able to allow the Nazis to hurt so many people and take over was probably because the Germans had more sociopaths in their country than other countries. Milgram, who himself was Jewish, didn't think that that was the case. That didn't make sense to him. And so he created a study to determine if he could get people to do a horrible thing, to kill someone, essentially. His study went something like this. Only one person in the study was actually the subject, and that is the person that we're going to call the teacher. The student is an actor, And then, of course, the researcher is an actor. Um, the researcher, you'll notice, has a white lab coat and a notepad. Um, and what they're told is that they're going to give questions to the student. The teacher is going to ask the student some questions, and they're going to study whether positive punishment is going to help the student learn the information better. But of course, that's not really what's happening. The student is an actor. The real person that's being observed is the teacher. And so the teacher will ask the student a question. And if the student gets it wrong, then the teacher has to give the student an electric shock. And you'll see the machine there. Um, each one of those little knobs, when you press them, give the student an electric shock. Mind you, again, this is all an act. The student is in another room and they're not really getting shocked. They are just acting. There's a student getting shocked. When the second question is asked, if the student gets it wrong, now instead of giving a 15-volt electric shock, they have to increase it to a 30-volt shock. And again, if the student gets it wrong, then he gets shocked. Eventually, the teacher is going to start getting upset by this, especially because the actor has been told to scream and pretend that it's very, very painful. And he says, "Get me out of here! Hey, I have a heart condition." And the teacher gets overwhelmed by hearing that. He says, "Hey, we should stop." And the researcher, who is just standing there with a clipboard and a white lab coat, only says, "The experiment requires that you continue." And so again, the teacher accepts that, they obey, and they keep on asking the next question. But of course, now they have to give a higher voltage. And you can't really see it in a picture like this one, but each one of those little knobs has some phrase on top of it. At first, it's just the amount of the voltage, but towards the end, it says like triple X, death, or something like that. And again, this starts to frighten the teacher. And so again, the teacher will say, who's responsible if this guy dies? And the experimenter says, well, I'll be responsible. And you know what happens? They keep on going. They keep on asking questions, and they keep on shocking. Eventually, the actor playing the student stops giving answers altogether, as if though he's passed out or dead. And of course, again, this makes the teacher sort of worried, and they will hear the researcher say, "No answer counts as a wrong answer. You must deliver the shock." And sure enough, they will give the shock to this person who is either passed out or dead by this point. Now, another thing that the researcher might say is you have no choice but to continue. These are just very specific things. The actor playing the researcher is given to say. There's not a lot of things that they're allowed to say because everybody is supposed to get more or less the same responses. Now, almost everybody gets to 300 volts, okay, which is enough to kill someone. And about 2/3 of everyone get to the very end, which is 450 volts. So most people would have killed this individual. And what we learn from Milgram's experiment is that it's not that the Germans were especially sociopathic or anything like that, is that we all submit to authority. And when an authority tells us to do something, most of the time we acquiesce and we just do what they tell us. Think about your boss telling you to do something you don't want to do, to clean a bathroom you don't want to clean, or to come to work when you didn't want to come into work. Most of us just sort of accept authority figures. And so when you put someone who is essentially willing to kill someone in a position of authority, the people underneath that authority figure are mostly going to follow along. And it's very rare where people stand up against the authority. Now, there are a few situations where people may stand up against authority. In subsequent research, right, other researchers have tried to, replicate Milgram's study, and sure enough, most of them replicate it. But if they change certain social dynamics, certain social situations, then all of a sudden, more people are willing to stand up. So if the teacher is forced to put the learner's hand on an object that is going to shock them, more people are willing to stand up against the authority of the researcher and say, I'm not going to put that guy's hand there. He's about to die. Um, if the experimenter or the researcher, the person in the white lab coat, isn't in the room with you, if they call you from a different room, it's easier to say to the phone, I'm not doing that, right? Think about, how much more willing to stand up, against atrocities people are on the internet, where no one's really seeing them, or the same way, sort of backwards, how willing people are to troll others because no one is seeing them. Well, in the same way, when you don't have to look at the authority figure in the face, it's easier to stand up against them. If there are two teachers, right, and one of the other teachers is also an actor, if that teacher who's an actor stands up and says, I'm not going to continue, then the subject, again, the subject doesn't know that the other teacher is an actor. The subject is willing to stand up too, right? When someone who is similar to you stands up against the authority figure, it makes it easier for you to stand up against the authority figure. And what we know from more research, more modern research, is that the first person is important. The first person to stand up against authority is important. But the second person to stand up against an authority figure, that's the dam breaker, right? That after somebody else stands up with the first individual, it makes it so much easier for everybody else who is having doubts to stand up too. Because now it's not just this lone guy, it's these two guys. And with me, we're a group. And so it becomes easier. Now, in the same way, if there are two teachers and one of the teachers has to hit the button to deliver the shock, and the subject, the real person who is being studied, only has to read the question, you see there that it makes it so much easier to go all the way up to 450. 92% of those individuals go all the way, because essentially it's very easy to tell yourself, well, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm just reading the questions. That guy is pressing the button. So it becomes really easy to just accept that. Now, when female participants were the teacher instead of men, again, you don't see that much of a difference. The difference is about 65% to maybe around 66%, 2/3. So it's not really that big of a difference. Men and women, that's not the dynamic that's important. The dynamic that's important here is the authority figure and whether or not we're willing to stand up against them. Now, in Asher's study is a little different, not too different. In Asher's study, again, most people in the study are actually actors. The teacher is an actor. Most of the other students are actors. And in our scenario, the girl in the purple dress is the only real subject here. And so at first, they are given a line. Let's see the blue line there. And they're asked, which of the multiple choice is closest in length to the blue line? And at first, everybody says the right answer. A, says the girl in the red. A, says the boy in the green. A, says the boy in the blue. The girl in the blue says A. And so when it's time for the girl in the purple dress, she just says what the right answer is, what she thinks is the right answer is, A. And they'll do that a few times where they'll ask everybody and everybody says the right answer. But eventually, they'll change it up. And now, where it's clear that the right answer is B, everyone gives the wrong answer. And the girl in the red shirt says C, and the boy in the green shirt says C, and the boy in the blue says C, and the girl in the blue says C. And you would think the girl in the purple would say, oh, to me it's B, but she won't. She'll say C, even though she knows that that's wrong. Again, in part, this is because we tend to assume that, wow, everybody else can't be wrong. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm seeing something wrong, or maybe the teacher asked a different question that I didn't get, right? And all of a sudden, most people will submit to sort of the peer pressure here and say C, even though that's clearly the wrong answer. Let me talk a little bit about the murder of Kitty Genovese. Um, this was essentially a news article that a woman was murdered. She was stabbed, but there was a lot of commotion beforehand. And it turned out that more than 30 people heard the commotion outside. And no one went out to help. And again, there was this question as to why didn't anyone go out to help? Why didn't anyone call the police? And then eventually people did call the police just way later, way after the police could have helped at all. And again, the problem seems to be that most people assume that somebody else will handle it, right? Well, so, it's not my business. Somebody else will call the police, or they're not sure what to do. What should I do when I hear somebody being hurt? Now, at the time, the way the story was written up, it talked about the apathy that people had, right? The lack of concern. But that's probably not what the problem was. It's not that people lacked concern, it's that in order to take a stance around sort of the social rules, a lot of stuff has to happen. One of them is first you have to notice that something is occurring and that something is out of the ordinary, right? And so you hear this people yelling, and you first usually will ask yourself, is someone in trouble or is that just people messing around? Once you notice that something is wrong, then there's something else your mind has to do. It has to correctly interpret the situation and do so in a way that you notice it requires your help. Then you also have to feel that it's your responsibility to intervene. Is it my place to do something about that? And then finally, you have to decide how to help the person in distress. And although if you're sitting alone at home thinking about it, it's very easy to go, yeah, if someone is hurt or someone is hurting another person, it it's my job to at least call the cops or something like that. But in the moment, it's very hard to make those decisions because the harder and the more difficult and the more stress is put on you, the easier it is for your brain to default into what you are already doing. This is something that we understand from behavioral economics. When a decision is difficult, your brain essentially resets into accepting whatever you were doing originally. Unfortunately, what most people were doing originally was nothing. And so that ends up being what they end up doing, nothing. The bystander effect works very similarly. Um, in a study, they will have an individual sitting in a room. Maybe they think that they're coming in for an interview. And in the room, all of a sudden, smoke will start coming out of a vent or just sort of from a different part of the room. If that individual is alone, they will stand up and go check where the smoke is coming from, um, and usually tell somebody about it. But if there are multiple people in the room and those other multiple people are not doing anything, right? They're actors too. So there's all this smoke, but no one is looking, no one is paying attention. Most people do not stand up to go check why there is smoke. And in some situations, they will literally make it so that there's fire, so they can see the flames. And yet people do not stand up to go check the fire because there is this diffusion of responsibility. You go, oh, well, if everybody else is here, how come they're not doing anything about it, right? And we sometimes call this pluralistic ignorance. If no one else is doing something, then maybe I'm the one that's wrong. Now, another social dynamic that is important to consider is whether working alone is better than working in a group. And it turns out that there are a lot of other dynamics that play a role here, one of them being cultural. Sometimes when people work together, it creates what we call social facilitation. Essentially, being around other people makes you think, oh, I want these people to think well of me, and I want them to think that I am a good worker. And so you end up doing more, you work better, and the quality of your work gets higher. Where sometimes when you're in a group, what ends up happening is what we call social loafing, where you start chatting, you start interacting, and that social dynamic takes a more important role than the actual work. And so your work is slower and usually of lower quality. Um, Now, there's another thing that happens sometimes where the group dynamic becomes so important to the group that that sort of takes precedence over what's right or wrong. And we call this groupthink. Essentially, we start to sort of think about, oh, well, what is this person going to say? Or we didn't go through this specific uh, format last time. And that takes precedence. And so whether something is right or wrong stops being important. Whether something is good quality or bad quality stops being important. What matters is that the group goes through their social dynamic or whatever they decide their social dynamic is. I see this a lot with students who maybe in high school they did a lot of group work. And then when they are forced to work alone, they can't get to an answer on their own. Not because they don't know the answer, but because they always want to ask somebody else. They always want to go, what did you get? Or how did you get to the answer? Because they're so used to the group work that the group thing sort of becomes more important. But of course, all throughout history, we can see where um, groupthink takes over, and then all of a sudden, whether something is right or wrong doesn't matter so long as the group dynamic sort of plays out. And sometimes, of course, this leads to disastrous events where people get hurt or discriminated against, etc.